The autumn wind swept across the Kansas prairie like a restless spirit, carrying with it the scent of dried grass and the promise of winter's approach. Margaret Sullivan stood on the wooden porch of her small farmhouse, her weathered hands gripping the rail as she watched a lone rider approach through the amber twilight. The man sat tall in his saddle, his broad shoulders cutting a striking silhouette against the endless sky. She had been expecting him, though not with any particular pleasure. Word traveled fast in these parts, and everyone within 50 miles knew that the mighty Plainsman Jacob Stone was riding through the territory. Stories of his exploits had reached even her isolated homestead, tales of cattle drives across impossible terrain, of standing down entire gangs of rustlers with nothing but iron will and steady aim, of bringing order to lawless towns that had given up hope of civilization. Margaret smoothed her worn cotton dress and tucked a strand of prematurely gray hair behind her ear. At 32, she had the hands of a woman who had worked hard all her life and the eyes of someone who had seen too much sorrow. The approaching rider would find no beauty here, she thought bitterly. Only a woman worn down by 3 years of struggling to maintain a failing farm and the weight of a reputation that preceded her like a curse. Jacob Stone brought his horse to a halt at her fence line and tipped his hat with practiced courtesy. Even from a distance, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes and the quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from him like heat from a forge. His clothes were trail-dusty but well-made. His beard neatly trimmed despite weeks on the range. This was a man who maintained his standards no matter where life took him. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm looking for a place to water my horse and rest for the evening. Would you have space in your barn?" Margaret felt her chest tighten with the familiar anxiety that gripped her whenever strangers appeared at her door. In the 3 years since Thomas had died, she had learned to read men's faces quickly, to distinguish between those who sought simple hospitality and those who saw a lone woman as an opportunity for something far less honorable. This plainsman's face revealed nothing but polite interest, but she had been fooled before. "The well is free to all travelers," she replied carefully, not moving from her position on the porch. "There's space in the barn if you're willing to share it with my milk cow and a few chickens." Jacob dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot. He was taller than she had expected, with the kind of lean strength that came from hard living and constant movement. As he led his horse toward the well, Margaret noticed the way he moved, alert but not nervous, ready for trouble but not expecting it. This was a man comfortable with himself and his place in the world. "I'm grateful for your hospitality," he said as he worked the pump handle, watching the clear water splash into the wooden trough. "Name's Jacob Stone. I'm heading north to Dodge City on business." "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, then immediately regretted giving her name so readily. But something about his straightforward manner had caught her off guard. There was no calculation in his eyes, no assessment of her vulnerability. He treated her with the same respectful courtesy he would show any homesteader, and that was so rare in her experience that it left her momentarily flustered. As Jacob's horse drank deeply, he glanced around the homestead with the practiced eye of a man who understood the challenges of frontier life. The barn needed repairs. Several fence posts were leaning dangerously, and the vegetable garden showed signs of neglect despite Margaret's obvious efforts to maintain it. But he also noticed the clean windows, the swept porch, and the carefully tended flower bed beside the front door. This was a woman fighting to maintain not just her property, but her dignity. "This is fine land," he commented, running his hand along a fence rail that wobbled under the pressure. "Good soil, plenty of water. Must be a challenge working it alone." The words were spoken matter-of-factly, without pity or judgment, but they hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had grown so accustomed to the whispered comments and knowing looks from the townspeople that simple acknowledgement of her situation felt almost shocking. "I manage," she said stiffly, then immediately regretted the defensive tone. This man had shown her nothing but courtesy, and here she was bristling like a cornered cat. Jacob nodded as if her answer was perfectly reasonable and continued his inspection of the property. Margaret found herself watching him with reluctant fascination. Most men who stopped at her farm fell into one of two categories: those who saw her isolation as an opportunity for impropriety, and those who treated her with the kind of exaggerated pity that made her skin crawl. Jacob Stone did neither. He simply accepted her as she was, a fellow human being trying to make her way in a hard world. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jacob finished tending to his horse and approached the porch. Margaret tensed, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that leaned against the doorframe just inside the house. But he stopped at a respectful distance, hat in his hand. "I wonder if I might trouble you for the loan of some tools," he said. "I noticed your fence there is in need of attention, and I've got some time before dark. Consider it payment for the use of your barn." Margaret stared at him in amazement. In 3 years, no man had offered to help with the endless repairs that plagued her homestead without expecting something in return. The few times she had hired help from town, she had endured uncomfortable suggestions and lingering looks that made her feel like prey being stalked by predators. "You don't owe me anything for barn space," she said carefully. "I wouldn't ask payment from any traveler in need of shelter." "Maybe not," Jacob replied with a slight smile. "But I was raised to earn my keep, and I've got the skills to fix what's broken. Seems a shame to let good fence posts go to waste when a little work could set them right." Before Margaret could protest, he had spotted her small tool shed and was examining the contents with the eye of an experienced craftsman. Within minutes, he had selected what he needed and was stripping off his coat to tackle the sagging fence. Margaret watched from the porch, torn between gratitude and suspicion. What did this man want from her? In her experience, no one did anything without expecting something in return. As Jacob worked, his movements efficient and sure, Margaret found herself studying him more closely. His hands were those of a working man, scarred and calloused but skilled. He approached the fence repair with the same methodical competence he had shown in caring for his horse, each action purposeful and precise. There was something deeply reassuring about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing and took pride in doing it well. The sound of hammering and the scrape of wood against wood filled the evening air as Jacob reset the fence posts and reinforced the rails. Margaret realized she should offer him something to drink, but the thought of inviting him closer to the house made her stomach clench with anxiety. Instead, she went inside and returned with a cup of water and a slice of cornbread wrapped in a clean cloth. "You must be thirsty," she said, setting the refreshments on the porch rail but keeping her distance. Jacob paused in his work and approached the porch, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Sullivan. Nothing tastes better than water when you've been working hard." He drank deeply, then bit into the cornbread with obvious appreciation. "This is excellent," he said sincerely. "You're a fine cook." Margaret felt an unexpected flush of pleasure at the compliment. It had been so long since anyone had praised anything she did that she had almost forgotten how good such words could feel. "It's nothing special," she said, but her tone had lost its defensive edge. "I disagree," Jacob replied, finishing the bread and handing back the empty cup. "Good cornbread is an art, and this is as fine as any I've tasted." As darkness began to settle over the prairie, Jacob completed his work on the fence and returned the tools to their proper places. The repaired section stood straight and strong, a marked improvement over its previous condition. Margaret felt a pang of guilt at how much better her property looked with just a few hours of skilled attention. "Thank you," she said quietly, as Jacob gathered his belongings and headed toward the barn. "You didn't have to do that." "No trouble at all," he replied. "I enjoyed the work. It's been a while since I've had the chance to build something instead of just moving through." There was something wistful in his tone that caught Margaret's attention. She found herself wondering about this man's life, about what it meant to be constantly traveling, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots or form lasting connections. It seemed like a lonely existence, though she supposed it had its freedoms as well. "There's a pump behind the house if you want to wash up," she offered, surprising herself with the gesture. "And I could spare some supper if you're hungry." Jacob paused in the barn doorway, his expression thoughtful. "I'd be grateful for both," he said finally, "but only if it's no trouble. I don't want to impose on your kindness." Margaret nodded stiffly and retreated into the house, her heart pounding with an anxiety that had nothing to do with fear. She busied herself preparing a simple meal of fried potatoes, preserved ham, and more of the cornbread he had complimented. As she worked, she could hear the sound of water splashing behind the house, and found herself imagining the Plainsman cleaning the day's dust from his hands and face. When Jacob appeared at her back door 20 minutes later, his hair damp and his shirt freshly changed, Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Without the layer of trail dust, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, probably no more than 35, with the kind of weathered good looks that came from years of outdoor living. More unsettling was the realization that he was genuinely handsome, and that she was noticing such things for the first time since Thomas's death. "Something smells wonderful," he said, as she invited him to sit at her small kitchen table. "You're very generous to share your meal with a stranger." Margaret served the food in silence, acutely aware of his presence in her home. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too intimate, and she found herself retreating to the stove rather than joining him at the table. This man's simple presence was stirring feelings she had thought buried forever, and she didn't know how to cope with the confusion of emotions swirling through her chest. "Won't you sit?" Jacob asked gently. "It seems wrong to let you serve me like hired help when you're being so kind." Reluctantly, Margaret took the chair across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Jacob ate with the same methodical appreciation he brought to everything else, pausing occasionally to comment on the flavor of the food or ask polite questions about her farming efforts. His presence was oddly soothing, she realized. Unlike the men from town who visited her with ulterior motives, Jacob seemed content simply to enjoy a good meal and pleasant conversation. "You mentioned you're traveling to Dodge City on business," Margaret said, desperate to fill the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "If you don't mind my asking, what kind of work brings you through these parts?" Jacob finished chewing and set down his fork thoughtfully. "I'm what you might call a problem solver," he said with a slight smile. "When towns or ranchers have difficulties they can't handle themselves, they send for me. Could be rustlers, could be boundary disputes, could be corrupt officials. I help restore order and fairness where it's been lost." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard stories of such men, gunfighters and enforcers who sold their skills to the highest bidder. Some were little better than outlaws themselves, using their reputations for violence to intimidate and control. But looking at Jacob's calm, steady demeanor, she found it hard to reconcile those dark tales with the man sitting across from her. "That sounds dangerous," she said carefully. "It can be," Jacob admitted. "But I've found that most conflicts can be resolved without bloodshed if you approach them with patience and respect for all parties involved. People usually want the same basic things: safety for their families, fair treatment, and the chance to build something worthwhile with their lives. When you remember that, solutions become possible." Margaret studied his face, searching for signs of deception or bravado, but found only quiet sincerity. This was not a man who gloried in violence or used fear as a tool. Whatever he did to earn his reputation, it seemed to weigh on him rather than inflate his ego. As they finished the meal, Jacob insisted on helping with the dishes despite Margaret's protests. Working side by side at the wash basin, she became acutely aware of his physical presence, the way his sleeves were rolled up to reveal strong forearms, the subtle scent of soap and leather that clung to his clothes, the careful way he handled her few precious dishes as if they were made of the finest china. "You have a peaceful home here," he said as he dried the last plate. "There's something to be said for a place where a person can think clearly and live according to their own values." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected compliment. Peace was the last thing she associated with her life these days, but perhaps it appeared different from the outside. "It wasn't always so quiet," she said before she could stop herself. "My husband Thomas worked this land with me for 7 years before he died. We had plans for expansion, dreams of building something lasting." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, recognizing the weight of grief in her words. "He must have been a good man to inspire such loyalty," he said finally. "Not everyone fights so hard to preserve what they've built together." The simple acknowledgement of her struggle, free from pity or judgment, broke something loose in Margaret's chest. For 3 years, she had endured sympathetic clucking from church ladies, crude suggestions from men who saw her widowhood as an opportunity, and the constant pressure to give up and move to town where a woman alone belonged. No one had ever simply recognized her efforts as worthy of respect. "I should check on the animals," she said abruptly, needing to escape the intensity of the moment. "Make yourself comfortable. There are blankets in the barn if you get cold during the night." Jacob nodded, understanding, and made no move to follow her outside. Margaret spent far longer than necessary checking on her cow and chickens, using the time to compose herself and wrestle her emotions back under control. When she finally returned to the house, she found that Jacob had banked the fire and extinguished all but one lamp, leaving the kitchen clean and tidy. From her bedroom window, she could see a faint glow coming from the barn and knew he had lit a small lantern for reading, or perhaps to write in whatever journal traveling men kept to record their experiences. The thought of him out there, separated from her by only a few yards of night air, made sleep impossible. Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why a stranger's presence had affected her so profoundly. She had convinced herself that part of her had died with Thomas, that she was no longer capable of feeling attraction or desire. But Jacob Stone's quiet competence and respectful manner had awakened something she thought lost forever. The realization terrified her. She had no room in her life for such complications, no energy to spare for emotions that could only lead to disappointment and pain. As the hours passed and exhaustion finally began to claim her, Margaret found herself remembering the feeling of working alongside Jacob at the wash basin. The way his presence had made her small kitchen feel warm and alive instead of merely functional. For just a few hours, she had felt like a woman again, instead of simply a burden that the community tolerated out of duty. Tomorrow he would ride away to whatever waited for him in Dodge City, and her life would return to its familiar patterns of isolation and struggle. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Margaret Sullivan fell asleep feeling less alone in the world. Outside, the autumn wind continued to sweep across the prairie, but somehow it no longer sounded quite so restless or cold. Dawn came slowly to the Kansas prairie, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold that gradually gave way to the clear blue of another autumn day. Margaret woke to the sound of movement in her barn and the low murmur of a man's voice speaking gently to the animals. For a moment, she lay still and let herself enjoy the unfamiliar comfort of knowing someone else was taking care of the morning chores. When she finally emerged from the house with a basin of fresh eggs and a pail for milking, She found Jacob had already fed her cow and chickens and was examining her old plow with the critical eye of a man who understood farming equipment. His horse stood ready for travel, saddlebags packed and bedroll secured behind the cantle. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, straightening up from his inspection of the plow. "I hope I didn't wake you. I wanted to get an early start, but I noticed this blade needs sharpening if you're planning any fall plowing." Margaret felt an unexpected stab of disappointment at the reminder that he was leaving. She had grown so accustomed to solitude that she had forgotten how pleasant it could be to share the burden of daily tasks with another competent adult. "Thank you for seeing to the animals," she said, setting down her egg basket and approaching the cow with practiced efficiency. "You didn't need to do that." "Force of habit," Jacob replied with a slight smile. "I was raised on a farm in Missouri before I took to traveling. Some things become second nature." As Margaret worked, she felt Jacob's eyes on her and realized he was watching her technique with the same careful attention he had given her fence and plow. There was nothing improper in his observation, merely the assessment of one working person evaluating another's skills. When she finished milking and turned to find him nodding approval, she felt a flush of pride she hadn't experienced in years. "You handle that cow like you've been doing it all your life," he commented. "She trusts you completely." "Bessie and I have an understanding," Margaret said, giving the cow an affectionate pat on the flank. "She gives me milk, and I make sure she's comfortable and well-fed. Fair exchange." Jacob chuckled at that, a rich sound that sent an unexpected warmth through Margaret's chest. "Sounds like the foundation of all good partnerships," he said. "Mutual respect and clear expectations." As they walked back toward the house together, Margaret found herself struggling to think of ways to extend their conversation. The thought of returning to her isolated routine after tasting companionship again made her feel hollow inside. But what could she possibly say to a man like Jacob Stone? What interest could a wandering plainsman have in the mundane concerns of a struggling widow? "I was planning to make biscuits for breakfast," she heard herself saying. "If you're not in a hurry to reach the road, you're welcome to join me." Jacob paused in the act of checking his saddle cinch, his expression thoughtful. "That's very kind of you," he said slowly. "The truth is, I'm not expected in Dodge City for another 3 days. I allowed extra time in case of weather or other delays." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat at the implication. "You could stay another night if the barn suits you," she offered carefully. "I noticed the roof over my chicken coop needs repair, and there are a few other small jobs that would benefit from experienced hands." For a long moment, Jacob studied her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent. She had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her careful words to the loneliness beneath. But when he spoke, his tone was gentle rather than pitying. "I'd be honored to help," he said simply, "and I'd be grateful for another of your excellent meals. It's been a long time since I've enjoyed such fine cooking." Relief flooded through Margaret so powerfully that she had to turn away to hide her expression. As she busied herself preparing breakfast, she tried to understand what was happening to her. 3 years of careful self-protection were crumbling in the face of simple human kindness, and she didn't know whether to embrace the feeling or run from it. Jacob proved himself as capable at breakfast conversation as he was at fence repair, asking thoughtful questions about her farming methods and sharing stories of agricultural innovations he had seen in his travels. Margaret found herself talking more freely than she had in months, describing her struggles with crop rotation and her experiments with different varieties of corn and wheat. "You've got good instincts," Jacob said, as he helped himself to a third biscuit slathered with her homemade preserves. "Most farmers stick to what their fathers did without considering whether it's suited to their particular land. You're thinking like a scientist." Margaret laughed, a genuine sound of pleasure that surprised them both. "Thomas used to say I was too stubborn to fail at anything I set my mind to. I suppose I'm just too proud to admit defeat." Pride can be a virtue when it's founded on principles, Jacob replied. There's nothing shameful about fighting to preserve what you and your husband built together. The mention of Thomas sobered Margaret, reminding her of the vast gulf between her situation and that of the confident man sitting across from her. Whatever warmth existed between them was temporary, an illusion created by proximity and her desperate hunger for companionship. Men like Jacob Stone didn't settle down with worn-out widows struggling to save failing farms. After breakfast, Jacob set to work on the chicken coop roof while Margaret tackled her weekly washing. From her position at the washboard, she could watch him work and marvel again at his methodical competence. He approached each task as if it were important, giving his full attention to even the smallest details. When several shingles proved beyond repair, he rode to her small woodpile and split new ones with an expertise that spoke of years of experience. The morning passed quickly, filled with the comfortable sounds of productive work. Margaret found herself humming as she hung clothes on the line, a habit she had lost during the dark months after Thomas's death. Having another person nearby, even one focused on his own tasks, made the world feel less empty and threatening. Around midday, as Margaret was preparing a simple lunch of cold ham and leftover biscuits, she heard the sound of approaching horses and felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Visitors to her isolated homestead were rarely welcome, and multiple riders usually meant trouble of one sort or another. Jacob appeared at her kitchen door as if he had materialized from thin air, his expression alert but calm. "You expecting company?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved to the window. 3 men were riding up her lane, their posture and clothing marking them as the kind of drifters who made honest folk nervous. She recognized the leader, Bill Crenshaw, a man who had made several unwelcome visits to her farm over the past year, each time becoming more insistent in his suggestions that she needed protection from the dangers of living alone. "Stay inside," Jacob said softly, but Margaret was already reaching for the rifle that leaned beside her door. "No," she said firmly. "This is my property and I won't hide in my own home. Besides, they know I'm here." Jacob studied her face for a moment, then nodded with what might have been approval. "Then we'll face them together," he said. "But let me do the talking unless they address you directly." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for his use of the word "we." For 3 years, she had faced every challenge alone, and the simple knowledge that someone was willing to stand beside her made her feel stronger than she had since Thomas's death. The 3 men reined in their horses at the edge of her yard, their eyes immediately fixing on Jacob with the wary assessment of predators encountering unexpected competition. Bill Crenshaw was a big man who used his size to intimidate, but even he seemed to shrink slightly under Jacob's steady regard. "Morning, Margaret," Crenshaw called out, deliberately using her first name to establish a familiarity that didn't exist. "Didn't expect to find you entertaining visitors." "Mr. Stone is a traveler who needed shelter for his horse," Margaret replied coolly, "as any decent person would provide." Crenshaw's eyes narrowed at the implied criticism, but he kept his attention focused on Jacob. "Stone," he repeated slowly. "That name sounds familiar. You wouldn't be the same Jacob Stone who cleaned up that trouble in Abilene last summer?" "I might be," Jacob replied mildly. "Depends on what you heard about it." Margaret felt the tension in the air thicken as the 3 men exchanged glances. Whatever Jacob had done in Abilene, it was clearly significant enough to give them pause. Crenshaw's swagger diminished noticeably as he reassessed the situation. "Just heard some rustlers got themselves convinced to find other employment," one of Crenshaw's companions said with forced casualness. "Nothing too dramatic." Jacob's smile was thin and cold. "I've always found that reasonable conversation works better than dramatics," he said. "Most men are willing to see sense when someone takes the time to explain their options clearly." The implied threat in his words was unmistakable, and Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This was not the gentleman who had shared her breakfast table, but someone far more dangerous. Yet she felt no fear of him, only a fierce satisfaction that someone was finally standing up to the bullies who had been making her life miserable. "We didn't come here looking for trouble," Crenshaw said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just checking on our neighbor. A woman alone can face all kinds of dangers out here." "Mrs. Sullivan seems quite capable of taking care of herself," Jacob replied. "And she's not alone at the moment. Perhaps you gentlemen have pressing business elsewhere?" The suggestion was polite in form, but utterly implacable in substance. Crenshaw's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but he was smart enough to recognize that he was outmatched. After a long moment of silent standoff, he jerked his horse's head around and spurred toward the road. "This isn't over, Margaret," he called back as his companions followed. "A woman in your position needs friends, not strangers who'll be gone by tomorrow." Jacob watched the three men ride away until they disappeared over a rise, his posture relaxed but alert. Only when they were completely out of sight did he turn back to Margaret, and she was relieved to see that the dangerous stranger had been replaced by the thoughtful man she was coming to know. "Old friends of yours?" he asked with gentle irony. Margaret laughed shakily, the sound carrying more hysteria than humor. "Bill Crenshaw has been trying to convince me to sell my land to him for the past 2 years. He seems to think that persistence will eventually overcome my refusal." "And what does he plan to offer in return for your cooperation?" The question was asked casually, but Margaret caught the steel beneath Jacob's mild tone. "Protection," she said bitterly. "Marriage to one of his associates, a partnership arrangement that would give him control of my property, various forms of assistance that would leave me obligated to him. He's very creative in his suggestions." Jacob's expression darkened. "And you've made your position clear?" "Repeatedly. But men like Bill Don Crenshaw don't believe that women should have the right to make their own decisions. He thinks my refusal is just feminine weakness that can be overcome with the right combination of pressure and intimidation." "I see." Jacob's voice was very quiet, and Margaret realized that Bill Crenshaw had just made a very dangerous enemy. "How long has this been going on?" "Since about 6 months after Thomas died. At first, it was just offers to buy the land at a fair price. When I refused, the offers became less generous and the methods more aggressive. Last month, someone cut my fence lines and drove off half my chickens. I can't prove it was him, but the timing was suspiciously convenient." Jacob absorbed this information with the same methodical attention he brought to everything else. Margaret could practically see him categorizing the threat and formulating responses. The realization that someone was finally taking her problems seriously brought tears to her eyes. "You can't fight him alone," Jacob said finally. "Men like Crenshaw respect only strength, and he knows you're isolated out here." Margaret felt her brief moment of hope crumble. "I know," she said quietly, "but I can't give up everything Thomas and I worked for just because some bully wants to steal it from me." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. When he spoke, his words were carefully measured. "What if you weren't alone? What if you had someone with both the ability and the legal right to stand with you against men like Crenshaw?" Margaret stared at him, not daring to believe she understood correctly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I've been traveling for 8 years, moving from one problem to the next without ever finding a place worth staying for. I'm saying that yesterday evening sharing dinner with you in your kitchen was the most at peace I've felt since I left home. I'm saying that if you were willing to consider it, I'd be honored to help you fight for what's yours." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible gulf. Margaret felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she struggled to process what he was offering. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know you're brave enough to face down 3 armed men rather than hide in your house. I know you're stubborn enough to fight impossible odds rather than surrender what you believe in. I know you're kind enough to offer hospitality to a stranger and skilled enough to run a farm that most men would have abandoned years ago. That's enough foundation to build on." Margaret turned away from the intensity in his eyes, her mind reeling with the implications of his proposal. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "I'm not what you think I am. I'm not someone any decent man would want as a wife." "What do you mean?" The question was asked so gently that Margaret felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble. For 3 years, she had carried the weight of her shame alone, too proud and too afraid to share the truth with anyone. But something about Jacob's steady presence made her feel safe enough to speak the words that had been poisoning her heart. "Thomas and I were married for 7 years," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. 7 years, and I never gave him a child. Not once did I even come close. The women in town whisper that I'm barren, cursed, that no man should tie himself to a wife who can't fulfill her most basic duty. They're right, Jacob. I'm damaged goods, unwanted as a spouse by any man with sense. The confession hung between them like a physical weight. Margaret waited for Jacob to make excuses and withdraw his offer, to mount his horse and ride away as any sensible man would do. Instead, she heard footsteps approaching and felt his presence beside her, solid and reassuring. "Look at me," he said softly. Reluctantly, Margaret raised her eyes to meet his. What she saw there was not pity or disappointment, but something that looked remarkably like tenderness. "Margaret Sullivan," he said firmly, "you are not damaged goods. You are not unwanted. You are a strong, capable, remarkable woman who has faced more challenges in 3 years than most people endure in a lifetime. Any man would be fortunate to have you as his partner. But children are a blessing when they come," Jacob interrupted gently. "But they're not the only measure of a marriage's worth. Some of the happiest couples I've known never had children. Some of the most miserable were surrounded by them. What matters is the bond between husband and wife, the respect and affection they share." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as years of buried pain finally found release. "The whole town thinks I failed Thomas," she sobbed. "They think that's why he worked himself to death, trying to compensate for having a useless wife." Jacob's hands settled on her shoulders with gentle firmness. "Thomas worked hard because he was building something with the woman he loved," he said. "He was trying to create a legacy that would honor both of you. His death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your failure." For the first time since Thomas's funeral, Margaret allowed herself to believe that someone might genuinely care about her welfare without expecting anything in return. Jacob's words didn't erase 3 years of whispered accusations and her own crushing guilt, but they offered a glimpse of a different way of seeing herself and her circumstances. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve," she said honestly. "I don't know if I can be what you deserve either," Jacob replied. "But I think we might have a chance to find out together, if you're willing to take the risk." Margaret looked up into his face and saw not the legendary Plainsman whose reputation had preceded him, but simply a man who was as lonely and uncertain as she was. The realization that someone of his obvious capabilities could be vulnerable enough to propose marriage to a near stranger made her own fears seem less insurmountable. "Crenshaw will be back," she said practically. "Probably with more men next time. Are you prepared for what that might mean?" Jacob's smile was grim but determined. "I've been preparing for men like Bill Crenshaw my whole adult life. The question is whether you're prepared to stand beside someone who attracts that kind of trouble." Margaret thought of the long, lonely months stretching ahead, of watching her farm slowly deteriorate while fighting a battle she couldn't win alone. Then she thought of the way Jacob had treated her with respect and kindness, The way his presence had made her feel like a whole person again instead of a burden to be tolerated. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm prepared." Jacob's answering smile transformed his entire face, replacing the careful control she had grown accustomed to with genuine joy. "Then we'll face whatever comes together," he said. "Partners in every sense of the word." As the afternoon sun climbed higher in the autumn sky, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would no longer face them alone. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to believe that she might actually be wanted as a spouse, cherished for who she was rather than judged for what she couldn't provide. The sound of distant thunder rumbled across the prairie, promising rain before nightfall. But standing beside Jacob Stone, watching him study her land with the eyes of a man planning for the future, Margaret felt only gratitude for the storm that had driven him to her door. Sometimes, she reflected, the most unexpected arrivals brought the greatest blessings. The storm arrived just after sunset, sweeping across the Kansas prairie with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain lashed against the windows of Margaret's farmhouse while thunder rolled overhead like the sound of distant artillery. Inside, she moved around her small kitchen with nervous energy, preparing supper while acutely aware of Jacob's presence at her table. 3 hours had passed since his proposal, and she still felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The man who had ridden into her life less than 2 days ago was now offering to share her struggles, to stand beside her against whatever challenges the future might bring. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. "The roof's holding well," Jacob observed as he studied the ceiling for signs of leaks. "Your husband built this house to last." Margaret paused in her stirring of the stew, a pang of the old guilt striking her heart. "Thomas was a good carpenter," she said quietly. "He could fix anything, build anything we needed. I sometimes wonder what he would think of my decision to accept help from a stranger." Jacob was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "From what you've told me about him, I think he'd be relieved that someone was finally looking out for your welfare. A man who loved his wife as much as Thomas clearly loved you wouldn't want her to suffer alone." The simple observation struck Margaret with unexpected force. In all her months of guilt and self-recrimination, she had never considered that Thomas might have wanted her to find companionship again. She had been so focused on preserving his memory and their shared dreams that she hadn't thought about what he would have wanted for her happiness. "I never considered that," she admitted, setting down her spoon to look at Jacob directly. "I've been so determined to prove I could manage alone that I forgot Thomas always said we were stronger together than apart." "Maybe this is his way of taking care of you one last time," Jacob suggested gently, "bringing someone into your life who's willing to fight for the same things he valued." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the intimacy of the moment. She whirled toward the front of the house as something heavy crashed through her parlor window, followed by the thunder of horses' hooves and rough masculine laughter. Jacob was on his feet and moving toward the sound before the echo died away, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Stay behind me," he ordered, all traces of gentleness vanishing from his voice. Margaret ignored the command, grabbing her rifle from beside the kitchen door as she followed him toward the parlor. On the floor beneath the broken window lay a large rock wrapped in a piece of paper, rainwater already soaking into her braided rug. Jacob carefully unfolded the paper, his expression growing darker as he read the crude message scrawled in pencil. "Last chance, widow. Marry into protection or lose everything you got left." "Crenshaw," Margaret breathed, anger overriding her fear. "He couldn't wait to see if you'd really leave." Outside, the sound of horses had faded into the storm, but Jacob's posture remained tense and alert. "He's testing us," he said grimly, "trying to see if we'll panic and run or if we're prepared to stand our ground." Margaret felt her hands shake as she stared at the broken window, rain beginning to drip steadily onto her floor. 3 years of careful economy had left her with no money for repairs, and winter was approaching fast. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Jacob's presence beside her like a steadying force. "We'll board up the window for tonight," he said practically. "Tomorrow we'll ride into town and file a complaint with the sheriff. It's time to make this official." "Sheriff Daniels won't help," Margaret said bitterly. "Crenshaw has been careful never to do anything in front of witnesses, and his word carries more weight than mine. Besides, Daniels thinks women should be grateful for any man's protection, no matter what form it takes." Jacob's smile was cold and predatory. "Daniels might feel differently when he understands that you're no longer unprotected. Men like that respect authority, and I carry more of it than Crenshaw knows." As they worked together to secure the broken window with boards from Jacob's hastily constructed pile of lumber, Margaret found herself watching him with new eyes. The gentle man who had shared her meals and helped with her chores was gone, replaced by someone far more formidable. But instead of frightening her, this glimpse of his other nature made her feel safer than she had in months. "You're not just a drifter who solves problems, are you?" she asked as they finished their makeshift repair. "There's more to your story than you've told me." Jacob paused in his hammering, considering how much to reveal. "I was a lawman for 6 years before I started traveling," he said finally. "Deputy United States Marshal working out of Kansas City. I still carry the authority, even though I no longer answer to the district office." Margaret felt her breath catch. A federal marshal was a far different proposition than the wandering gunfighter she had imagined. "Why did you leave?" "Because I got tired of politics interfering with justice," Jacob replied grimly. "Too many times I was ordered to look the other way when influential men broke the law, told to focus on easier targets while the real criminals operated with impunity. I decided I could do more good on my own." The revelation explained much about Jacob's calm competence and the respect his name commanded even among men like Crenshaw. It also made Margaret realize that his offer of marriage was not the desperate proposal of a lonely drifter, but the considered decision of a man accustomed to weighing risks and making difficult choices. "Are you sure you want to tie yourself to my problems?" she asked quietly. "Crenshaw may be more dangerous than you think. He has connections in town, friends who owe him favors. Taking him on could complicate your life considerably." Jacob set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I've spent 8 years moving from one conflict to the next, always leaving when the problem was solved. I'm tired of having nothing to fight for except other people's causes. This farm, this life you've built, it's worth defending. You're worth defending." The conviction in his voice made Margaret's chest tighten with emotion. "Even knowing what I told you about children?" "Especially knowing that," Jacob replied firmly. "Any fool can father children. It takes a special kind of man to love a woman for who she is, not what she can give him. Thomas understood that. So do I." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as another layer of her long-carried shame began to dissolve. For 3 years, she had defined herself by her perceived failure as a wife. But Jacob's words offered a different perspective, one that honored her worth as a person rather than measuring her value by societal expectations. The storm raged outside for another hour before gradually moving on, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed earth and the steady drip of water from the eaves. As Margaret prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not about the challenges that lay ahead, but about the profound relief of no longer facing them alone. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the prairie stretch endlessly in all directions. Margaret woke to find Jacob already up and moving around outside, checking the repairs he had made, and assessing any damage from the storm. When she emerged from the house with a basin for collecting eggs, she found him examining fresh tracks in the mud near her barn. 5 horses, maybe 6, he said grimly. They came back during the night and spent some time looking around. Didn't take anything, just wanted us to know they could get close whenever they chose. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do we do? We make it clear that intimidation works both ways, Jacob replied. But first, we take care of the legal formalities. If you're still willing, I'd like us to be married before we confront Crenshaw directly. The suggestion was practical rather than romantic, but Margaret found it oddly reassuring. Jacob was approaching their union like the strategic alliance it was, acknowledging that affection might grow between them while ensuring they both understood the immediate benefits of legal partnership. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Millbrook once a month, she said. Reverend Patterson. He should be there this weekend. Then we'll ride to town this afternoon and make the arrangements, Jacob decided. I want everything legal and documented before we face Crenshaw again. A man like that will look for any excuse to claim you're still unprotected. The ride to Millbrook took 2 hours across rolling prairie that showed the first hints of winter's approach. Margaret rode side saddle on her gentle mare, while Jacob kept his horse to an easy pace beside her, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The normalcy of traveling together, sharing observations about the weather and the condition of various farms they passed, made Margaret feel like part of a functioning partnership for the first time in years. Millbrook was typical of the small prairie towns that served the scattered farming communities of Kansas. One main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a combination general store and post office, a blacksmith shop, and 2 saloons that catered to cowboys and travelers. As they rode down the dusty street, Margaret was acutely aware of the curious stares their arrival generated. Let them look, Jacob said quietly, noticing her discomfort. By tomorrow, everyone will know you're under federal protection. That should discourage most troublemakers. Their first stop was the sheriff's office, where Jacob presented his credentials to a surprised Sheriff Daniels and filed an official complaint about the previous night's vandalism. The sheriff's attitude underwent a dramatic transformation when he realized he was dealing with a U.S. Marshal rather than an ordinary drifter. I'll certainly look into these allegations, Marshal Stone, Daniels said nervously. Of course, without witnesses, it's difficult to pursue charges. I understand completely, Jacob replied with deceptive mildness. I'm sure you'll conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, I wanted to make sure you're aware that Mrs. Sullivan is under federal protection now. Any further harassment will be considered interference with a federal officer's duties. The warning was polite in form, but unmistakable in substance. Daniels nodded rapidly, clearly eager to avoid conflict with federal authority. Margaret watched the exchange with fascination, finally understanding how Jacob had built his reputation for resolving difficult situations without violence. The threat of force was always present, but rarely needed when backed by legitimate authority. Their next stop was the general store, where Jacob made several purchases that raised eyebrows among the other customers. In addition to window glass and putty for repairs, he bought ammunition for both his rifle and pistol, lamp oil, and enough supplies to withstand a siege if necessary. Expecting trouble, Marshal? Asked the storekeeper. A nervous man named Fletcher who clearly recognized the significance of Jacob's presence in town. Just being prepared, Jacob replied calmly. I've found that visible readiness often prevents the kind of trouble that catches people unprepared. Word of their presence had obviously spread throughout the small town because by the time they reached Reverend Patterson's boarding house, a small crowd had gathered to witness their business. The preacher himself was a practical man in his 60s who had seen enough of frontier life to recognize a serious situation when he encountered one. Marshal Stone, he said after examining Jacob's credentials. I've heard your name mentioned in several towns. You've built quite a reputation for bringing order to chaotic situations. I try to help where I can, Reverend. Mrs. Sullivan and I would like to be married as soon as possible. Are you available to perform the ceremony this evening? Patterson studied their faces carefully, taking in Margaret's nervous determination and Jacob's quiet competence. This isn't exactly a conventional courtship, is it? He observed mildly. No, sir, Jacob replied honestly, but our circumstances aren't conventional either. I can promise you that my intentions are honorable and my commitment is sincere. And you, Mrs. Sullivan? The preacher asked gently. Are you entering this marriage of your own free will? Margaret felt the weight of the question and the watching crowd. For a moment she hesitated, thinking of all the reasons why marrying a near stranger was foolish and dangerous. Then she remembered the loneliness of the past 3 years, the fear that had become her constant companion, and the gentle strength Jacob had shown in their brief time together. Yes, Reverend, she said firmly. I am. Patterson nodded slowly. Then I'll be honored to perform the ceremony. Shall we say 7 o'clock this evening? That will give you time to make whatever arrangements you need. As they left the preacher's house, Margaret felt the reality of what they were doing settle over her like a weight. In a few hours, she would be Mrs. Jacob Stone, wife to a man she had known for less than 3 days. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the insanity of such a decision, but her heart whispered that sometimes the most important choices had to be made on faith rather than logic. Are you having second thoughts? Jacob asked quietly as they walked back toward their horses. Every few minutes, Margaret admitted. But not about marrying you, about whether I'm doing the right thing by dragging you into my problems. Jacob stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious but kind. Margaret, I've been alone for 8 years. I've seen enough of the world to know that finding someone worth sharing it with is the rarest kind of blessing. I'm not being dragged into anything. I'm choosing this, choosing you, with my eyes wide open. The simple declaration made Margaret's chest tight with emotion. I'll try to be worthy of that choice, she said softly. You already are, Jacob replied. Now let's go get married and start building a life together. The ceremony that evening was simple but meaningful, conducted in the parlor of the boarding house with Reverend Patterson's wife and 2 other town residents serving as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been her Sunday finest during happier days with Thomas. Jacob had cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes, looking every inch the respectable lawman he was. As they spoke their vows in the flickering lamplight, Margaret felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This wasn't the romantic love match she had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was something perhaps more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared determination. When Jacob slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, she felt the weight of it like a promise of protection and companionship. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Patterson intoned solemnly. May God bless your union and grant you many years of happiness together. Jacob's kiss was gentle and respectful, a seal on their agreement rather than a passionate declaration. But Margaret found herself responding to the warmth of his lips and the solid strength of his hands on her shoulders. Perhaps affection would grow between them with time. Perhaps this practical arrangement could become something deeper and more meaningful. As they prepared to ride back to the farm in the gathering darkness, Margaret felt a mixture of hope and trepidation that left her lightheaded. She was no longer Margaret Sullivan, the failed widow struggling to survive alone. She was Margaret Stone, wife to a federal marshal and partner in whatever adventures lay ahead. The ride home passed quietly. Both of them lost in thought about the magnitude of what they had just undertaken. It wasn't until they crested the final hill before Margaret's farm that Jacob suddenly reined in his horse, his posture going tense and alert. Someone's been here, he said grimly, pointing toward the house. "The lamp I left burning in the kitchen is out, and I can see light coming from the barn." Margaret felt her heart sink as she realized that Crenshaw had chosen this night, of all nights, to escalate his campaign of intimidation. But as Jacob checked his weapons and turned his horse toward the farm buildings, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, confidence that she wasn't facing this threat alone. "What do we do?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We show them that Mrs. I's Margaret Stone is under federal protection," Jacob replied grimly, "and that anyone who threatens her welfare will answer to the United States government." As they rode toward whatever confrontation awaited them, Margaret realized that she was no longer afraid. Whatever happened next, she would face it as part of a team, supported by someone who had chosen to stand with her against all comers. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere, to someone who valued her enough to fight for her safety and happiness. The lonely widow, who had admitted her unworthiness to a stranger just 3 days ago, was gone forever. In her place was a woman ready to claim her rightful place in the world, supported by a partner who saw her strength rather than her limitations. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as husband and wife, as equals in every sense that mattered. The autumn wind that had once sounded so restless and cold now seemed to whisper promises of new beginnings and hard-won happiness. Margaret Stone squared her shoulders and rode toward her future, no longer alone in the vast prairie night.